Hi, this is the Bread and Roses virtual tour, part of the 36th annual Bread and Roses Labor Day Heritage Festival, which of course is streaming online this year. My name's Jimbo Shane. I work at Lawrence Heritage State Park, part of the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. And we're going to give you a tour of Lawrence with some of the history of the city and more so the history of the Bread and Roses strike, which is what we're here to commemorate. Now, Lawrence was founded in the late 1840s by a group of Yankee merchant industrialists led by Abbott Lawrence. They were imitating what had already been done with great success and profit in Lowell 20 years earlier. So they bought land on both sides of the river and started building the city of Lawrence. Their vision was to have a good place to live and work, and we'll see that as we go along, some of the examples of their paternalism. One of them is the Common, a 17-acre park behind me, which is land that was donated to the city by the Essex Company so that the residents would have a place, a decent place to relax on their time off. We've been having the Bread and Roses Festival here for the last 35 years, but we'll do it virtually this year. Towards the end of the tour, we will take you into the Common to see a couple of the sites there. We're here at the Great Stone Dam, which was built during the founding era of Lawrence over 3 years, from 1845 to 1848. It's the basis of the water power system that powered the mills originally. So they constructed this giant dam across the Merrimack River. It obviously holds the water up behind the dam, and that high water feeds into the canals, flows down to the mills, and then would flow through the mills to generate the power. The dam cost $250,000 to build, which was an awful lot of money back then in the 1840s. And that's why it required some very wealthy businessmen to create the foundation for the city. Now, in the course of the construction, there were 2 lives lost building the dam. It was at the time, quite possibly, the largest dam in the world. It's 900 feet across, 32 feet high, and 35 feet wide at the base. And it hasn't needed a single major repair in 172 years. It is still generating power, however, not by sending water down the canals, but rather through a modern hydroelectric plant here on the south side of the dam that was built around 1980. Okay, I'm standing at Canal Street, intersection with Jackson Street, and behind me is the North Canal and some of the mills, specifically the Washington Mill right now. When Lawrence was founded, they had to develop the water power infrastructure to power the mills. So the canal was built to take water from the river from above the dam, bring it down this way to drop into the mills to generate the power. Also, in the founding era, the mill owners hired young women off the farms of New England to operate the machines in the mills. They have come to be called the Yankee Mill Girls. Yankee because they were from old New England families. This was a labor system that was made famous in the mills in Lowell in the 1820s and 30s. And the mill owners here, some of whom were involved in the mills in Lowell too, wanted to do the same thing when they started. So they built a number of boarding houses up and down Canal Street here. Now there's only 2 boarding houses left, and one of them is right here, which also now serves as the visitor center for Lawrence Heritage State Park. But in the founding era, the mill owners hired these young women from New England and provided supervised housing in these boarding houses. because they were Yankee women, okay? They felt an obligation to act as paternalistically, shall we say, like a parent. So there was supervised living there with rules of behavior, moral rules, etc. However, this system didn't last long in Lawrence. For various reasons, the mill girl system was already in trouble in the 1840s, and soon the Yankee mill girls were replaced by wave after wave of immigrant workers, starting with the Irish, who came to escaping the potato famine in the late 1840s. So gradually the workforce became mostly immigrant, and oh, by the way, the mill owners didn't care so much about the immigrants' housing, so the boarding house system faded away. The immigrants were left to their own devices to find housing. Now, the building now houses Lawrence Heritage State Park's Visitor Center. We've been here for 35 years. There's a permanent exhibit on the history of Lawrence on the first 2 floors, and a gallery and meeting space on the 3rd floor. Unfortunately, we are closed now due to the pandemic, but hopefully before too long we'll reopen and folks can come in 7 days a week from 9 to 4, our normal hours, and explore the exhibits and learn a lot more about the history of Lawrence and Lawrence today. We're standing in front of the Pemberton Mill. I should say the new Pemberton Mill. The original Pemberton Mill, on the exact same spot, collapsed and burned in 1860. We call it the Pemberton Mill disaster. Now, this was big news at the time, national news actually. In the disaster, about 100 mill workers were killed. And of the dead, a little over half were Irish. So it gives us a picture in time of the transition from the original workforce of Yankee mill girls to a predominantly immigrant workforce. And it was noted at the time and since that the collapse of the Pemberton Mill more or less symbolized the end of paternalism, the mill owner's original desire to both make a profit and provide a decent place for the workers. And it's not a coincidence that that happened as the workforce became mostly immigrant. And that was the beginning of the end of the paternalistic interest in the well-being of the workers in the mills. Okay, we are in South Lawrence now, standing in front of the Everett Mill. The Everett Mill was one of 2 gigantic mills built in the first decade of the 20th century, between 1900 and 1910, and were part of the American Woolen Company, which had just been created and which became by far the largest mill company in Lawrence. By 1912, it operated 2/3 of the mills and employed 2/3 of the mill workers in Lawrence. The Everett Mill, the nearest one here, has a fabulous clock tower on top, which is kind of an unofficial symbol for Lawrence. It is now the 3rd largest 4-face tower clock in the world. For many years, it was the 2nd largest, second only to Big Ben in London. And you get a better idea how big the clock is if you go to the park's visitor center, where we have a pair of the original hands hanging on the wall. Of course, you have to wait till we reopen after the pandemic. Now, the American Woolen Company, building these giant mills, created thousands of jobs, which attracted the new immigrants of that time to Lawrence, led by Italians and Syrians, Poles, Lithuanians, Eastern European Jews, etc., etc. The population doubled in 20 years, and during that time, living and working conditions were actually getting worse. And these are the conditions that led the workers to go out on strike in 1912 in what we know as the Bread and Roses strike. Being the biggest mill company in town, The head of the American Woolen Company, William Wood, became the face of the mills and the man who would decide when and under what conditions the mill owners might settle or how the strike would end. Okay, now we're standing in front of the Lawrence History Center building and complex. The Lawrence History Center is Lawrence's historical society, and it's a wonderful resource for anyone interested in Lawrence history. The building, however, was originally the headquarters of the Essex Company. That's the company that developed Lawrence, built the water power infrastructure. They retained a presence in Lawrence, renting water from the canals to the mills and maintaining the water power system. They were not directly involved in the strike because they didn't own any mills, but the ownership of the Essex Company overlapped completely with the ownership of the mills. So they had a stake in it, even if they weren't directly involved. One thing I like to point out about the Essex Company complex here is the 10-foot brick wall that surrounds it, which is, I think, the last of its kind remaining in Lawrence. But it's significant because all of the mills originally had similar brick walls surrounding the complex. The purpose being to control the access and egress of the workers, and maybe also to control the access of any labor organizers who might want to come in to talk to the workers. So all the mills had these giant walls around them with gates where the access into and out of the mills at the beginning and the end of the day was controlled. Now, also in this area, we have a very important structure, which is the Everett Mill. I should say the new Everett Mill, which was built in 1909. There's another earlier, smaller mill behind it. But it's one of those three giant mills that were built in the early 20th century that attracted so many new immigrants to come to Lawrence. It happens to be where the strike broke out. Now, the immediate cause of the strike, aside from the general low pay and lousy conditions, was a reduction in the hours from 56 hours a week to 54 hours a week that was put into law by the Massachusetts legislature in 1911 to take effect in the beginning of 1912. The law, by the way, only affected women and children. It didn't reduce the men's hours, but the mills reduced everyone's hours because they all worked together. The work was interconnected and the men would have nothing to do for those extra 2 hours. So everyone's hours were being cut, but they didn't know if their wages were going to be cut accordingly. That was not the intent of the law. But when they got their paychecks, their first paychecks in 1912, they found that their wages had been cut accordingly. Now that first happened here in the Everett Mill, where for some reason a department of weavers, mostly Polish women, got their pay on a Thursday. And they saw that their pay had been cut, and they began to get up and walk out, shouting, "Short pay, all out." Now, the vast majority of the workers got their paychecks the next day, of Friday. And that began the major walkout from all the mills, 20,000 workers walking out in protest. And that was the beginning of the Bread and Roses strike. Now, during the strike, the state militia was called out to help control things. And although they were supposedly here to keep the peace, that mostly meant protecting the mills and the mill owners' property. So the militia units were mostly housed in the mill buildings. And there are photos of militia units marching in and out of the Everett Mill here through that giant arched front door. And oh, by the way, some of the militia units were made up of Harvard students who came here and got academic credit for coming here to help put a lid on the strikers. Because, of course, Harvard students at that time were the sons of wealthy Yankees, same people who owned the mills. Third thing here of interest is Holy Rosary Church across the street. This was an Italian Catholic parish for many, many years and was so during the strike in 1912. And the Italians were a major part of the strike as the largest of the new immigrant groups who were the most exploited in the mills. In the beginning of the strike, the pastor was sympathetic and actually had a soup kitchen going in the parish to help the strikers get by during the strike. But that ended quickly after a couple of weeks when Father O'Reilly from St. Mary's Parish and the vicar in charge of all the Catholic parishes in Lawrence came back from vacation, saw what was going on, and was appalled by it because the strike was being led by the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, or the Wobblies, a radical union with a socialist underlying philosophy. Socialism at that time was completely unacceptable to the Catholic Church because they felt it would lead the workers to atheism, ultimately. So that was beyond the pale. Father O'Reilly immediately ordered all the churches in Lawrence to oppose the strike, in many cases from the pulpit, and in some cases even going house to house, telling the workers not to participate in the bread and roses strike. Well, now we're at the corner of Union and Garden Streets, an intersection that played a very important role in the strike. Behind me is the Everett Mill, one of those giant mills built right after 1900. It's unlike most of the other mills because it's not parallel to the canal and the rivers. It's actually perpendicular, jutting out several blocks into this area, which was an almost entirely Italian neighborhood. And in this intersection, during the strike, there was a confrontation between strikers and police. And in the course of that battle, a shot was fired and hit a young woman who was just passing by. Her name was Lopizzo. She was about a 26-year-old Italian immigrant woman who was one of the mill workers, but was probably not involved in the demonstration. And yet, passing nearby, she was shot. We don't know who fired the shot. The strikers blamed the police blamed the strikers. To this day, we do not know who fired the shot. But her death became a cause célèbre, a real rallying cry for the strikers. In fact, it was used by the authorities to try to cripple the strike. After Lopizzo's death, they arrested the two strike leaders that were sent here by the IWW. Ettore and Giovannitti were their names. And the authorities felt that if they took those two men out of commission, that the strike would be leaderless and would collapse. Now, they were nowhere near here at the time of the shooting, but they were arrested on the theory that, well, by advocating, urging workers to be out in the streets demonstrating, that they were somehow accessories to the murder. So Ettore and Giovannitti are arrested on murder charges, spend the rest of the strike and several months after in jail. It did not work, though, as far as derailing the strike. The workers were determined to carry on, and the IW sent two of its best-known organizers to Lawrence to carry on the leadership. Those are Big Bill Haywood and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. So the strike carried on after that. Now, Lopizzo was one of two workers killed in the early part of the strike. The other was a teenage Syrian boy named John Ramey. Now, Ramey was not a mill worker, we don't think, He was actually part of a Syrian band, and this band was leading a group of Syrian strikers down a street. Now, they confronted a group of militiamen who formed a line across the street with their rifles and bayonets drawn. And when they started to force the strikers to retreat, this column of strikers approaching them, well, the band members in front couldn't retreat fast enough with all the workers behind them. So Ramey was actually hit in the back with a bayonet in that confrontation. Now, he walked home, but he bled to death that night in his home. So there were 2 workers killed during the strike. And their ethnicities, one Italian and one Syrian, is kind of representative of the ethnic makeup of the strike. Now, the mythology of the strike says that all the immigrants got together and cooperated. And to some extent, that was true. But there was a hierarchy of ethnic immigrant groups in Lawrence, starting with the group that had arrived first and in large numbers, which of course was the Irish. By 1912, they'd been here for 3 generations, had worked their way up in the city, in business, running city government, and providing most of the personnel in the police force. So the Irish were not too sympathetic to the strikers or to the new immigrants. And that was in part also due to the influence of the Catholic Church leaders who came out against the strike. There would be one more death of a striker, although that happened months later in the aftermath of the strike, and that was Jonas Molskas, the Lithuanian man who was beaten to death because he was still wearing his IWW button. So the deaths in the strike do represent the ethnic makeup of the new immigrants who were the bulk of the strikers here in Lawrence. So I'm standing on the common in front of the former location of a bandstand that was a key site during the Bread and Roses strike. The bandstand would have been about 20 yards behind me. And it's where the strikers held many of their mass meetings of 10, 15, 20,000 people here on the common. And because the strikers represented so many different nationalities and mostly very new immigrants, the strike meetings were held in multiple languages. And fortunately, several of the IWW organizers knew several languages and could address the crowds of strikers here. Now, at some point early on in the strike, their ability to use the common for meetings was prohibited by the city. They were also prohibited from parading or marching along the Mill District. So gradually their ability to march in protest was limited downtown and then eventually just in the immigrant neighborhoods nearby. Despite all these obstacles, they did eventually win the strike. And the key episodes were, number one, when the strikers were sending their children to live with sympathizers in other cities, which was a pretty good strategy, both for relief and for publicity, which the authorities in the city didn't like. So they tried to stop it by sending police and militia to the train station when about the 4th or 5th contingent of children was to be sent to Philadelphia. Well, they prevented the mothers from putting their children on the train by force. It was described as a riot by some. Women and children were arrested, and that created even more bad publicity for the mills. That prompted a congressional investigation and a hearing in which people from Lawrence testified, one of whom was a young girl named Carmela Tioli, who testified about having had part of her scalp ripped out by the machinery when she was working underage. This testimony horrified the nation and brought the textile mills in Lawrence to the bargaining table to settle the strike. So the strikers won most of their major demands. The increase in wages, particularly for the lower skilled workers, some changes in the work rules, and the promise that there would be no punishment, retaliation, recriminations against strikers once everybody went back to work. Unfortunately, that promise was not kept, and there was retaliation against activists who couldn't get their jobs back or were fired once they were discovered. So the blacklist was definitely put into effect here in Lawrence. The mill owners relented and came to the bargaining table and settled the strike on favorable terms for the strikers. At that point, they were allowed to have one final meeting here on the Common around the bandstand to vote to accept the settlement, and then the celebration and the victory parade began. Unfortunately, that was not the end of the story here, because the opposition to the strike among the powers that be in the city was not satisfied to allow the workers to have their win, and most importantly to them, to allow the IWW to remain in Lawrence and to be so influential with the workers in Lawrence. So they organized a campaign to drive the IWW out of Lawrence. This actually began during the strike, continued through the summer, and then in the fall, when Etter and Giovannini were about to go on trial for the murder of Annie Lopizzo, they organized a giant demonstration against the IWW, which was called the God and Country Parade. Now, they were effectively forcing the workers to choose. Either you can remain loyal to the union or you can be a good American. You can't be both. And they enforced this by social pressure, by economic pressure, namely the blacklist, and lastly by the real threat of violence that was here in the streets. In fact, a third victim of the strike, a man named Jonas Molskas, a Lithuanian worker, was beaten to death in the fall of 1912 because he was still wearing his IWW button. So the God and Country Parade, in the eyes of the powers that be, saved Lawrence, they felt. And so much so that they erected this flagpole here, the Shattuck flagpole, to commemorate the God and Country Parade. And for the next 99 years, this was the only monument to the events of 1912. And the God and Country Parade was the official story of the events of 1912. And it held that the workers were kind of ignorant, new immigrants who fell under the sway of the radical IWW outside agitators, and the city was saved by the God and Country movement. And that was the official story here in Lawrence for the next 60 plus years. The story of the strike here in Lawrence began to change in the 1970s under a few different influences, new approaches to history, looking at oppressed peoples and so on. We also had two New Yorkers come to Lawrence to help us unearth our own history, our forgotten history, an artist and a journalist. And they, along with some of the younger people in Lawrence who were open to new ideas and new interpretations, came to the realization that the strike was something that we could celebrate and be proud of. And you know, whether you agree or disagree with the IWW's radical politics, we could pretty much all agree that our immigrant ancestors were exploited by the mills. They fought and struggled bravely to change their working conditions, and that folks since then have benefited by those sacrifices. So from that time forward, 1980 or so, we have celebrated the Bread and Roses strike here, not least with the annual festival. After that long struggle, which the strikers amazingly won, and after 60 plus years in which the strike was a forgotten memory in Lawrence, the revival took place, and then finally in 2012, which was the centennial of the strike, we finally had the erection of this monument behind me, the Strikers Monument, which celebrates the strike and the strikers for their amazing struggle and sacrifice. So thanks to our local historians Jonas Molskas and Dave Meehan, who led the campaign, we now have this gorgeous monument to commemorate that struggle and hopefully to inspire us for the struggles of today. That's the end of the tour. Thanks for joining us, and if you have any questions about the strike or the aftermath, please don't hesitate to get in touch with the Bread and Roses Heritage Committee on our website, or me, Jimbo Shane, at Lawrence Heritage State Park. And thanks for coming along.